And that was Rhiannon Jones. Coming up on The Money today, UK retail sales fell last month as people pulled in their purse strings as the cost of living squeeze got tighter. We'll hold a detailed discussion with views from the retailing front line. Plus, rental costs are soaring with demand for properties at an all-time high. We'll be hearing from the National Residential Landlords Association, which represents almost 100,000 landlords across England and Wales. And each day on The Money features an in-depth Money Talks interview with a business leader or policymaker. Today, we're hearing from retailing legend Bill Grimsey, having worked his way up from butcher's boy to the boss of retailing giants like Iceland and Wix. He knows a bit about the shopping business, does Bill, and he insists the UK high street is far from dead. We just need to rethink it. That's later in the show. And as ever, I want your questions, opinions, ideas. What do you think of the issues raised in today's On The Money? How do they impact you? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @gbnews. Stay with us, because this is GB News on TV, DAB+, digital radio and online. I'm Liam Halligan, and you're on The Money. UK retail sales dropped sharply in March as the rising cost of living hit consumer spending. That's according to official data out today. The volume of retail sales fell far more than predicted, with online sales hit particularly hard as consumers reined in discretionary spending on luxuries and other non-essential items. Why? Because as the prices of food and fuel have skyrocketed, buying the basics now takes up an ever-rising share of household incomes. Retail sales in the UK fell no less than 1.4% in March compared to the previous month, and within that total, online sales were hit particularly hard, falling 7.9% compared to February, as consumers tightened their belts. These downbeat numbers are a clear sign high inflation is now translating into a serious economic slowdown. And as the cost of living squeeze gets tighter, household energy bills rising in April and tax rises kicking in, retail sales are likely to fall even more. Separate data out today from the research company GfK suggests that while retail sales fell in March, so far in April, consumer confidence has plunged even more to its lowest level since the 2008 financial crisis. I guess one bit of good news, for those with a mortgage anyway, is that because of this retail slowdown and consumer confidence nosedive, the Bank of England, which increased interest rates from 0.5 to 0.75% last month, may hesitate before pushing up rates more. The question remains, though, UK retail sale volumes are falling sharply and they're set to go down further. And that's our On The Money question today. How can the UK reverse this slump in retail sales? Grown-up conversations with people who know their stuff as ever here on The Money, and I'm talking today to the retail expert Kate Hardcastle. She's joining us from the US. Great to have you with us, Kate, as ever. And there's another Kate, the CEO of UK Hospitality. That's Kate Nichols, returning to On The Money. And in the studio, Jasmine Birtles, our very own Miss MoneyMagpie.com. Here she is. An expert, a doyen of all consumer and personal finance issues. Welcome to you all. Let's talk to you first, Kate Hardcastle, if we may. Are you surprised that UK retail sales actually fell in March compared to February and fell as much as they did?
I'm not surprised, and hello to everyone on the panel. I think it's very important to understand that we buy emotionally, and it makes complete sense, therefore, that if consumers are concerned about the way that their finances are going, they're going to make methodical steps in terms of trying to rein it back in. It doesn't mean that the end is nigh. Of course, we will start to see times again when consumers feel confident and will start to spend. But very much the focus is about the cost of living. Every headline was about the fuel crisis. The clarity was at the petrol pumps. The clarity was at the bills coming through the door. And we have to understand that as retail and hospitality and any service element that gives to the consumer an offer of goods or services, it has to understand that. It has to fluctuate with what consumers want. And you have to appeal to the appetite at that specific time. So if consumers want value, that's what you need to talk about. And if consumers want to feel that they're having a good time and they want some luxury, you have to appeal in that way too. So it makes good sense. That's the way that the retail revolution's always gone.
Let's turn to Kate Nichols, who is the CEO of UK Hospitality. Kate, I'm just looking at the fine print of this ONS Office for National Statistics data. It shows that food store sales were down 1.1% and spending on alcoholic drinks in stores and supermarkets shrank by 11.3%. But that's partly because, or you can tell me if I'm wrong, spending on food in pubs is going up, spending on alcohol in pubs is going up, and hotels and other hospitality venues. Is that what you're seeing or not?
I think you are seeing some of that in March. January, February time, we know is the time that customers don't tend to go out to hospitality. People do tend to stay at home. But March, they start to come out. The weather gets better. People do go out and socialise again. So I think some of the trends you're seeing, you're absolutely right. In the March figures, you are seeing a transfer of spend across into hospitality. It's a slight uptick in hospitality numbers and footfall. It is still well below 2019 levels in terms of volume and footfall into hospitality, but there is some transfer. I think what you are seeing here, though, and any anticipated slump that we got in retail sales to take account of that change, this is a far bigger slump than was being forecast. So people were anticipating you would see possibly 0.3, 0.5% slump in retail sales as some of the online experiences moved to be in-person experiences in hospitality. This is a much bigger slump that talks about a hit to consumer confidence, suggests that there is greater fragility, and suggests that that discretionary spending on which our economic recovery depends is quite fragile, and that we may see that being translated through into lower hospitality sales as we go forward in April, May, and the cost of living really starts to bite.
Indeed, it is a bigger slump than we thought. Just to repeat the numbers for those joining us in the last few minutes, UK retail sale volumes fell 1.4% in March and online sales were down 7.9%, less what we call discretionary spending on non-essentials because the cost of essentials themselves are going up so much, not least fuel and food. Jasmine, you run MoneyMagpie.com. You deal with queries from an awful lot of consumers, shoppers, spenders. Were you surprised by this number to the extent that I was?
I wasn't, to be honest, because, what we're hearing all the time is that people are very worried, as Kate Hardcastle pointed out, there's, it's an emotional spend, but it's also pounds and pence, because when you've seen your energy bill more than double, when it costs you more than £100 to fill your car with petrol, that actually makes you think, I really have to rein back my spending because these actual numbers are far bigger than I've had before. And also, of course, we do know already that people are using buy now, pay later schemes to just buy the basics. And we've had news from Nationwide that credit card spending is up again on the basics. So, as we've heard, the discretionary spend, which our economy rests on, is pretty fragile at the moment because people literally don't have the money. Either they think they don't or they actually don't have the money to spend on fun stuff.
Back to Kate Hardcastle, who is joining us from the US. Kate, I think it's worth saying that these are March numbers. So Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. So in March, we already had higher food prices, higher fuel prices, and so on. But what we didn't have in March was the increase in household utility bills, which Jasmine just mentioned, which only happened in April. So with the best will in the world, while we don't want to be too alarmist here, it strikes me that these March numbers are not going to be improved upon in April, and the April consumer confidence numbers, which came out from GfK today, would seem to bear that out.
I think we've got to be realistic that there's going to be perhaps a little bit more buoyancy in that confidence over the summer months. And one of the key drivers to that is the fact that surely the weather might change. And when the weather changes, people won't feel the need to hit the heating buttons in the house. They'll be trying to enjoy some of the summer. People have had 2 years now plus of restricted times to meet families, take holidays, go on day trips, etc. And quite rightly, people who can afford that will still want that in their lives. My biggest concern, and I was down at the Ideal Home Show for a month in March talking to the public about this day in, day out, how were they feeling, what were they doing to make those changes? And they were being very savvy and very knowledgeable about those small changes you can make, turning the thermostat down a little bit, trying to make provisions, buying more tinned goods in the food shop, etc. But the reality is, my biggest fear is autumn, Liam. That's really when we're going to feel the pinch once again, because we're going to see that fuel cap really start to impact families. We're going to see families trying to adjust any spending they've had over the summer period, facing into the Christmas period, which is always a pressurised spend. And the reality is we've got a lot of hard-pressed households already using food banks more than ever before. I was at a food bank recently talking about how their own volunteers were supplementing the foods and goods there out of their own pocket because they just couldn't meet demand. The reality is we are in a real crunch situation. The impact that will always have on retail and hospitality is that people are sensible. They will do what they can for their own families, their own households to get in control of that. There is support that is required and needed. But I think without sounding alarmist or doomsdayers, yes, I think we probably are yet to see the real impact, which is going to come later in the autumn.
Well, Kate Hardcastle, you're going to leave us now. Enjoy the rest of your time in the US. We look forward to seeing you back in the UK soon. We're going to carry on this discussion over the break. How can we rescue this slump in UK retail sales? We've got Kate Nichols, the CEO of UK Hospitality, Jasmine Birtles in the studio. More guests will be joining us after the break. So stay with us. You're on the money. Welcome back. It's 1:22. You're on the money. Now, UK retail sales dropped sharply in March as the rising cost of living hit consumer spending. We've had a 1.6% fall in retail sales and a 7.9% fall in online sales in March compared to the month before. So we're discussing how can we reverse that slump. Joining me now, I'm delighted to say we have Nathan Mills, who's the owner of The Butchery. Nathan oversees and runs a number of butchers' outlets across the capital here in London. Nathan, I'm really great to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really interested to talk to a butcher because it strikes me that people see meat as a necessity, but they might be asking for different cuts. They might be buying cheaper meats. They might be cutting their cloth according to their budget. What are you seeing as you're serving people in your various butcher outlets day to day?
There is a definite trend where people are watching what they are spending at the moment. People are really questioning every item. They are going for cheaper cuts. I think 10 years ago we opened in a recession, and that was when we see all the cheap cuts selling really quickly. And we've reverted back to that point now, but it's hard. It's hard at the moment. We're seeing a lot less foot traffic in through the stores at the moment, and we're back to sort of pre-pandemic price sort of sales. We have had price increases.
So it's less beef Wellington and a bit more scrag end, Nathan, that's going on. Are we seeing the return of interest in those cheaper cuts? Do you think this will change the way we eat meat? Do you think we'll eat less meat? Of course, that's been a trend over recent years. Could that trend accelerate?
There's been a sort of an impact there where it's environmental pressures, and now you've got this crisis that we're in at the moment. Yes, people are trying to eat less meat, but better quality meat, and that's where we sort of fit in. The cheaper cuts, yes, definitely. They're selling a lot quicker than your high-end beef Wellington cuts.
Very, very interesting. Now, Kate Nichols, thanks for staying with us. You're the CEO of UK Hospitality. Of course, pubs, restaurants, hotels are an important part of many, many high streets across the UK. And your sector in particular has been hit, hasn't it, by these tax rises because you were on a 5% rate of VAT at the height of the pandemic, then a 12.5% emergency rate of VAT. in recent months, but in April again, after these March numbers, in April again, your sector went back to full fat 20% VAT. What is the impact of that you're hearing from your members?
Well, we had a number of issues that changed. You had the VAT rate go up, you had business rates kick back in for our members, and then as a result of what was happening in Ukraine and the supply chain issues, you had really significant energy price bill increases for hospitality businesses, 150, 200% coming through, 30 to 50% increases coming through on much of our food. So you've had a big problem that's hit those businesses. They've got a cost of doing business crisis at the same time as their customers have got a cost of living crisis. So what our members are telling us is that they're having to put up prices to customers, often double-digit price increases, which obviously just deters customers from coming out, means that they buy less. So our revenues may be back up to 2019 levels, but footfall and sales volumes are down substantially. So in real terms, our members are sort of wading through treacle as they try and recover. And these are inflationary cost headwinds, which are just resulting in a turn-off in discretionary spend. So we fear that while you're seeing this in March retail figures on the high street, you will see it in April, May, June figures in hospitality. You will see consumer confidence fall, and you'll see discretionary spend turn off. And therefore, you will see an economic downturn in the high street more generally, just at a time when these businesses need to start getting moving again to get the economy moving.
One silver lining in this montage of clouds, Jasmine, may be if you've got a mortgage, the Bank of England might not raise interest rates as much as it was going to. We're still expecting an interest rate rise in the coming weeks from 0.75%, perhaps only to 1%, not to 1.25%. I mean, inflation is 4 times the Bank of England's 2% target. Yeah. They have to raise rates to retain any kind of inflation-fighting credibility, I would say, and yet they might ease off a little bit in terms of that rate rise because of these retail sales numbers being so disappointing, no?
Yeah, well, without wishing to put a downer on everything, I think we can say now that we are in stagflation, where you have, as you say, a stagnant economy, but you also have rising prices. And as you point out, that means that the Bank of England is in a cleft stick, really, because to deal with stagnant economy, you put the interest rates down. To deal with rising prices, you put interest rates up. And so they have to decide which is the more important. And I suspect, as you say, they will try to rein it in because they're too afraid of things falling apart.
Crashing the economy. Indeed, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, who we've criticised in the past, he gave a speech just yesterday in which he said he is concerned about sparking a deep recession if he and the Monetary Policy Committee, of course it's not up to him, there are 9 economists, aren't there, who vote. We're going to be hearing about a lot of those in the coming months. They're going to become well-known people emerging from the shadows, if you like. Nathan Mills, let's go back to you. You're there on the front line. You're talking to customers every day. You own and run a bunch of butchers across London. What would you say to Rishi Sunak, to Boris Johnson? What do you need to make sure that your business can survive, thrive, keep employing people, keep generating the turnover, the profits, fingers and toes crossed, that then fill the Treasury's coffers with tax revenue that the rest of us spend? What do you need, Nathan?
I think it's that cap on power supply, and I think our council rates to be reduced again, something that come in through the lockdowns and everything like that. We need support. The hospitality sector that we supply needs support. I think that's what I'd be asking for.
And is it the business rates that really hurt you, the sort of, rates you pay on the value of the property in which you work, whether you make any money or not, whether you sell a single pork chop or sausage?
If they weren't there, it'd help make the profits. That's a guarantee. I think the thing for us is the uncertainty of where we're going to be around October when we've got higher electricity bills. I think
because there's no price cap at all for businesses, is there? Let's give you the final word, Kate Nichols. I know you are running a very influential lobby group, UK Hospitality. Of course, hospitality employs about 1 in 10 British people. Are you hearing from ministers, from civil servants on the political grapevine that there could be some kind of emergency budget this summer?
We're not hearing any signs of an emergency budget. We know ministers and civil servants are working with us closely, hearing in real time the information that's coming through from businesses about what's happening to their cost base, what's happening on energy prices. We're continuing to push for solutions along the lines that Nathan talked about. We've got to give these businesses some breathing space to be able to keep prices as low as possible to consumers. Otherwise, we will be in that downward spiral. And unfortunately, I think the next 12 to 18 months could be as difficult for many businesses on the high street as the 12 to 18 months that we endured through COVID. So it's really important that we do everything we can to make sure that we don't cause a further recession. We don't have these businesses making the difficult choice between paying bills or paying their people.
Kate Nichols, CEO of UK Hospitality, always great to have you on the show with your analysis, your experience, and indeed Nathan Mills, owner of the Butchery Limited. All the best keeping your business ticking over. Thanks to all our guests today. Let's just quickly come on to some of your views. Neve got in touch with us to say UK discretionary spend will continue slumping until the cost of living crisis isn't as bad. This is the Chancellor's fault, says Neve. In Robert's view, if expenditure's way higher, there is no money left. End of. No sales, no revenue for the government. And Nick says people don't want to buy consumer products when they're worried if they can afford food and heating. Exactly right. The days of American consumerism are now dead. The purse strings will be tightened and businesses that sell non-essential goods will close. We always love to hear your views, so do keep them coming in throughout the show. Send us some good news. Can you see any light at the end of the tunnel? Is your retail business actually doing pretty well? Let us know. gbviews@gbnews.uk. This is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Coming up, in today's Money Talks interview, we talk to British businessman, ex-Iceland and Wix CEO Bill Grimsey. We'll be hearing his thoughts on the future of the high street after the GB News headlines with Rhiannon Jones. Welcome back. It's 1:37 just, and you're on the money with me, Liam Halligan. Now, millions of young adults can't afford to buy a home, of course, but the price of renting a house or flat is also soaring. Rents outside London have climbed 10.8% over the last year and are now £1,088 a month on average, 15% higher than before the pandemic. Buy-to-let landlords, many using a single property as a pension, have taken advantage of a rising market to sell, reducing homes available for tenants to rent. At the same time, there are concerns many rental properties are substandard. No less than 13% of private rental properties across Britain pose a serious threat to the health and safety of those living there. That's a quote from a recent report by the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee. Tenants trying to challenge landlords face a court process that is, quote, inaccessible, arduous and resource intensive. That again from that cross-party committee of MPs. Joining me now on the show to discuss this is Chief Executive at the National Landlord Association, Ben Beadle, and I'm still with my regular pal here in the studio, Jasmine Birtles. Ben, great to have you on the show. What did you make of that PAC report, the Public Accounts Committee?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's issues that need to be resolved within the sector. We're not blind to some of the issues that are there. I think landlords would look at this report and really struggle because a lot of landlords are doing a very, very good job. And that's borne out by government's own stats. 83% tenant satisfaction in the sector, higher than that in the social sector, yet we've got these issues around the edges that make for difficult reading. And I think this dials back for us around the enforcement regime that exists in the sector and how you differentiate the good from the bad.
Of course, many landlords are, a couple who maybe are, been working for a number of years. They've got a single property they rent out. That's their pension. Yep. We've got a whole generation of people who have done that. They're generally very good landlords, but some unscrupulous landlords ruin it for everyone else. don't they? I mean, 13% of properties affecting the health and safety of the tenants is a pretty high number.
It is, and there's no getting away from that. I mean, what I would say is that the private rented sector has expanded significantally in the past 20 years. It makes up
from about 10 to 20% of all households.
Exactly right. What I would also say is that it's now being expected to do things it was never expected or created to do. So we have lots of different types of tenants. We have families that require greater security than perhaps the private rented sector can afford. But I think we also have to look at the regime that private landlords are operating in. Remember, 94% are individuals. Half of those invest for their pension. Typically, they have 1 or 2 properties. So we're not talking property tycoons here. No. But what we're talking about is a lot of scrutiny on the sector. Big tax changes, greater regulation, the threat of an EPC and energy changes that's causing uncertainty to the market. And of course, landlords are looking at this and thinking, well, I'm being taxed a lot, I'm being pilloried, maybe I'm going to cash my chips in. And that is...
And then the property is no longer available for rent, but it might be available for someone to buy.
It might be. I mean, I question at the moment whether we're going to turn generation rent into generation buy.
Absolutely.
With everything else that's going
on. With unaffordability higher than it's ever been. The average house in the UK now costs 9 times average earnings. When I bought my first flat in the mid-90s, it was 4 times.
Yeah.
Just want to say also, Ben, we often highlight what tenants go through, the court process that's very difficult. If tenants try and ask a landlord a reasonable request, do repairs, and then they get pushed back and they get abused. But also it's worth saying that there are lots of landlords, people with 1 or 2 properties, who have sitting on huge rent arrears because they're not being paid post-lockdown because there were rent moratoriums and lower rents and so on. What can landlords do if they're owed thousands, often tens of thousands of pounds on properties they've still got mortgages on? Because this is ruining a lot of people.
I mean, I think what I would say on this is that there's good and bad on both sides of the fence, right? And, landlords that are experiencing significant arrears will be between a rock and a hard place because they've got the mortgage to pay. They don't have a great deal of help and, frankly, they don't have a great deal of sympathy. So I think, what I would encourage landlords and tenants to do is to speak to each other. We saw landlords bend over backwards during COVID to accommodate their tenants and to try and,
a lot of landlords gave rent cuts, didn't they? Quite significant rent cuts.
Absolutely.
Even though people were on furlough.
And I think this is the overriding point. You may not have expected landlords to have responded in the way that they did. But our own research commissioned by Donata found out that over 80% of tenants who asked their landlord for a gesture of some kind to sustain the tenancy during COVID got it. So we're not unreasonable people. It's in our interest to keep people in their homes and to have a really good relationship. But where that breaks down, we do need to look to the courts to help us out and to bring tenancies to a close if that's the ultimate action.
What do you make of this, Jasmine?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly we've heard that it's a two-way street. There are a lot of very good landlords, but there are some that are a problem. And I think one of the issues with quite a lot of landlords is, as you've mentioned, a lot more regulations, but at least that starts to weed out the ones that don't really want to do a proper job. So it's possible, I mean, I hate to say it, but we might need more regulation, particularly with landlords that live abroad. We may need to have some sort of rules that mean that either they can't rent out a property here or they have to have a middleman, an agent, who can actually do things.
And take responsibility.
Absolutely. I think that's probably the next thing that we need.
I wonder if I might just come back on
briefly,
that, because I think we've got 168 pieces of regulation in the sector. This is not the Wild West, but we miss a few sheriffs, right? We need better enforcement. We need to hold bad landlords to book, but recognise that the vast, vast majority of landlords do good by their tenant.
Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Landlords Association, and indeed Jasmine Birtles of MoneyMagpie.com. Thanks both for joining me today. Now, it's time for my daily interview series, It's Money Talks, and today we're going to meet Bill Grimsey. He's the former CEO of the likes of Iceland and Wick.